Welcome to the final lecture of the third season of the class, the Wisconsin Idea Past and Present. Thank you for coming to so many lectures. Thank you for coming out tonight. And I'd really like to thank our speaker who is joining us, who drove all the way down from the Twin Cities to be with us. But the interesting thing is, not only did he drive all the way down, he is also doing this talk, like all the other speakers in this series, for no pay. Okay? We are reimbursing his travel. Don't worry, David, because it's not fair to make it come out of your pocket. But so it's the commitment to public service. And you might wonder, how did a guy from Minnesota get such a commitment to public service? Anyone? Yeah, he's an alumnus of UW-Madison, so we are welcoming him home tonight. So David Weerts, PhD, got his PhD from the same department that I was in, is now at the University of Minnesota as an associate professor. He's also the coordinator of higher education programs and faculty director in academic planning and programs in the Office for Public Engagement. His work aims to help higher education leaders and their external partners collaborate more effectively to better serve society and build long-term support for colleges and universities. Over the past 15 years, that is since he left here, his scholarly work has focused on helping college and university leaders build productive relationships with external partners, including state policymakers, community partners, alumni, and donors. In pursuing this agenda, his research lies at the intersections of state-university relations, community engagement, institutional advancement, higher education leadership, and organizational development. His recent studies include historical analyses of state-university relations, longitudinal analyses of state appropriations for higher education, latent variable analyses predicting alumni support behaviors, and case studies of university community engagement practices. These investigations rely on a variety of disciplinary frames from economics, political science, sociology of organizations, social psychology, history, and religion. I did take a class with him when he was here, and he's an interesting guy. So please help me welcome Dr. David Weerts back to his alma mater.
Well, thank you so much. Can you hear me okay on this? That's terrific. Well, I'm honored that you would put your faith in your last lecture to a guy from Minnesota here, right, with the Minnesota Block M here. Yeah, that's right. Our axe is back. I don't know how long, but he'll come back here. I want to thank Gwen and the rest of the group here for just the real honor of this invitation to be here tonight. And I especially appreciate Gwen's work in this area for these many years and her commitment around this. And when I think about the Wisconsin Idea in present, I think about Gwen as a Wisconsin Idea treasure of bringing this together. So thank you, Gwen, for the work that you're doing. So the title for my talk today is called From the Good Society to the Productive Society, or the Prosperous Society, using those various terms, changing conceptions of the Wisconsin idea. And so this relates to some of the work that I've been doing over the past several years around interest around higher education as a public good. And how do we conceptualize this? What does this mean? What is the public good? There's actually one Chronicle of Higher Education article says they actually assign a date when it became a private good. It's sort of an interesting argument. But there's discussion around this. While I was here in Madison for 4 years, I worked at the UW Foundation. I was Director of Development for the Graduate School. And I think it was a real honor to be a part of some great public good kind of work that was going on. I helped support fundraising for the Arboretum, as well as the Weissman Center, Wisconsin Distinguished Graduate Fellowship Program, and meeting donors who would talk about the Wisconsin idea, what the public good meant, and folks who came from various ideologies, views of the world, who contributed to the university in various ways. And so what I really learned through some of this process, and even my own scholarship around this, is around the complexity of some of the story of the public good, for which the Wisconsin idea, I think, is a great example of this complexity. And one of the things we were talking here earlier with a colleague named Harry Boyd at Minnesota, who's a leading scholar in kind of democratic purposes of education. And he talks about As we look at changes over time, the tendency to maybe create villains and superheroes to explain shifts in higher education. And one of the things I found particularly interesting as I was reading about the complexity of these shifts over time is a piece in the Chronicle by Fisher and Stripling who talked about this change cannot be traced to any single moment in time. It cannot be laid at the feet of any one individual or ideology. Rather, it is a story of dozens and dozens of consequential moves made by individual actors across the country. They are lobbyists and activists, anti-tax conservatives and big government liberals, conflicted idealists and self-preservationists, even college leaders themselves. They are the American public. So I offer this as a way to explain going into the story of how we might think about the Wisconsin idea and changing views of public purpose of higher education. So here are some of the events prompting my interest in this topic. So as Gwen mentioned, I'm originally a Wisconsin guy here, living here most of my life. One story I told to one group years ago is that I feel like a true Wisconsinite as my grandfather worked for Pabst Brewery for many, many years. My father was a Lutheran minister, and if you go to any small town in Wisconsin, for sure you will see a bar and a church. So we had you covered, the Weerts family, in that particular scenario. I followed Wisconsin sports, and to my wife's chagrin, we were raising Packer fans in our home, who's a Minnesota wife. And one of the things I was thinking about is as I was watching the deliberations and things that happened, especially with Act 10 years ago, kind of glued to the radio about what was happening in Wisconsin. And it was all very dramatic at times. I remember eating lunch one day and turning it on, and one of the radio stations saying something like, "The Democrats are holed up in a hotel room in Illinois." I said, is this a hostage situation? Or it was hard to know what this was about from afar. But what I was particularly interested in is this event that will probably look familiar to many of you. And that is the event of the story around Governor Scott Walker and a budget revision that struck aspects of the Wisconsin idea. It was talked about in terms of search for truth, these other pieces that are kind of underpinnings of the Wisconsin idea, and replacing that to meet state workforce needs. I was particularly interested in a couple of reasons as a scholar of higher education. One is that there's a literature all about organizational identity in higher education, which for any sociologists in the room may be familiar with the work of Burton Clark in the mid kind of 20th century, where he was talking about that organizations in higher ed in this case have deep saga, or that is like stories that are deeply embedded in them that sort of have deeply held meanings across the institution. But some of this literature talks about how those sagas get edited over time due to a lot of different factors. And this, I thought, was a particularly interesting case around that. Another interesting piece, I thought, is the idea of how Wisconsin has sort of a microcosm of the broader policy environment in viewing the historic purposes of higher education. So I think for those of you who have maybe seen, have you seen the film, Starving the Beast? Okay, of which Wisconsin is a major player in that particular piece, but it talks about this kind of phenomenon across the country. The other last piece I was interested in is with what I thought was a gap in the literature. And that is, economists typically explain some of these stories around political changes in higher education as that higher ed was a public good and it become a private good. But it all sort of seemed too simple to me as I started to think about the broader changes in society and institutions in this context. And I was fortunate to have a sabbatical for a semester where I started reading about some of this through the lens of the humanities. And it was particularly interesting in history, religion, and philosophy to start going in this direction. And I'm hoping tonight will be a part of the sifting and winnowing around what's the truth here in understanding these various areas. So some of the topics for tonight, what I'd like to cover is a question, are these kind of three sets of questions. And one is, in what ways has the Wisconsin idea story been told or possibly edited over time, again related to this organizational identity piece? How might changes in the Wisconsin idea narrative reflect broad shifts in society and American higher education? So how is this representative of how we're thinking about as really a societal function? And then finally, maybe open to discussion, especially because I'm starting to think about this, but ideas for the future is how do we think about the Wisconsin idea in our current era of polarization and declining confidence in higher education? Is there a new Wisconsin idea story that could be told in this particular context? So one of the things I learned reading from the beginning from a lot of the historians is the caution against what they call golden ageism. And that is to say that, that there's a mythology of maybe the greatness of the past and all of these kind of things together. So while I was going through some of my archival kind of work related to this topic, I found some really interesting pieces that I thought I would share that provide some context. One by Curti and Christensen or Carstensen, who have the classic work in the history of the UW, those large volumes. And so here's a question for you. This is an all play for the group. So a media source once reported the Wisconsin legislature is plotting to gut and skin the university. Who reported it? Was it Wisconsin State Journal 2015? Or the Wisconsin Daily Patriot of 1858? All the above, he said. Yeah. So if you selected B, with maybe some tips for me, you were correct. So here were several tensions at the University of Wisconsin in the mid-19th century. So one particular tension was the view that the institution drifted from its Protestant practice and tradition. One Appleton clergy member declared that the university was of an infidel concern since Bible reading was no longer mandatory. A second issue was that the view that the institution should be more inclusive. Senator Charles Clement's speech in 1856 declared that students mostly draw from Madison and it's undemocratic since only a few could enjoy it. Yet there was another view that the institution didn't fill its mandate and was out of control on spending. Clement says the university was spendthrift, an accusation of extravagance. I also saw evidence that students were asking for a climbing wall and a lazy river. No, I'm just kidding. Wouldn't that be something, right? So that maybe didn't show up in the record. And another piece was around this Clark and Robbins report that UW is essentially a classical college, not providing enough practical emphasis, that it was to be different from the denominational colleges for the people in the practical arts. A line that I thought was especially humorous when you kind of laugh out loud in the archives and you feel a little awkward was one section of this talking about faculty liaisons to the legislature. And it says, faculty liaisons to the legislature reporting to the UW colleagues said this: and while there is no agreement among legislators as to what the university ought to be doing, there is an agreement that the university ought to be doing something else. So having this is around the mythology of the past, of how we think about these areas and the complexities around some of this work. So with that as a kind of entree into this, I'm going to explore these kind of notions through four time periods. One, late 19th century to the progressive era through the mid-20th century, the second half of the 20th century, through the Great Recession, 2008, and this Great Recession to the present. You'll see kind of some of those demarkers of why I picked those areas. So if I were my broad argument around this shift from the good society to the prosperous society is looking at how society had thought about the purposes of higher education. And when you look at UW leaders in this context over periods of time as a manifestation of how the country was developing and thought about the work of these institutions. And so this relates to a couple different categories. One is really the underlying view of the human, a view of freedom, a view of societal commitments, and the view of higher education as a public good. So what I'm arguing, hopefully, as we see some evidence around this, is that these are the various components. So, for example, in the good society, which is kind of broadly construed around, good in terms of commitments and a larger sense of what's good in society and the world, the underlying view is around this notion, what could be called this human flourishing perspective. And when you look at these pieces, Wilbert, de Ruyter, and others have argued that the conception of flourishing was around developing a whole life. It presupposes there are objective human goods around kind of transcendent means, and that flourishing is described in some way as the actualization of human potential in communities. And so from this, their view of freedom around this is essentially kind of maybe the odd notion of freedom from oneself, that people's stories were actually a part of a larger story, and they submitting to that kind of transcendent moral authority and sort of more of a providential view of their work in the university. So the view of societal commitments from that kind of flourishing perspective is covenantal, which is the idea of flourishing of the other. So this is a very relational framework that looks at how do we live generously in support of others and have this as a way of framing. So higher ed as a public good from that period was establishment and sustainability of a moral order for which economic purposes and equality and those things fit into this larger frame. The Prosperous society view is one that takes more of a human capital perspective. And so that's more materialist in its view. It's economic in nature. Economic freedom as a view of freedom is around freedom around personal and collective wealth. And the view of societal commitments in this realm is really more contractual. So it's around exchange, acquisition, rights, and accountability. And that kind of puts this relational framework into more of a legal policy framework. And then higher education through that realm is seen as local, state, and kind of national prosperity. I mentioned this to say that, and I provided the earlier story about these conflicts, is that these are not cookie-cutter views, but they represent kind of broad contours around society, and I'm going to share a little bit kind of around that. So when you think about how higher education developed in this context, one of the important pieces to look at is the early colonial colleges and the good society tradition from which many of the early UW leaders were part of this kind of early tradition. So this Colonial 9, as you see here, the main outcomes, or really the public purposes, was around local educational needs, which arose from pastoral and missionary demands. And this idea of covenant is sort of discussed within kind of these colonial colleges. There's a book by Mark Knoll called America's God, from Jonathan Edwards to Abraham Lincoln, where he talks about the covenantal view of society that was embedded in the teaching of these institutions. And so this covenant doctrine was central to the early formation of the country. It was a constitution between God and individual, church, and society. These duties emphasized divine purposes rather than a means toward human happiness. And this built a culture around commerce and governmental constitutions. It's important to acknowledge in this context that indeed the covenant was not for everyone. And that in many cases the covenant was abhorrent in its expression. So late sociologist Robert Bellow explained, the colonists had failed the covenant almost before it had been made, for they had founded the Commonwealth on a great crime, the bondage and genocide of other races. The very exclusiveness of their understanding of the covenant had perverted it. So it is in this complicated context that we make sense of this good society framing that was originally part of some Wisconsin idea underpinnings. So as we start to think about the societal context of this time as the Wisconsin idea, is this was a legacy of Protestantism that continued into this period. And this dominated even at the University of Wisconsin. So UW's first president, John Lathrop, he was a graduate of Yale as one of those colonial colleges. He articulated this view in the university in his 1849 address, his inaugural address, where he says, and if this state university is to be chosen instrumentally by which Wisconsin shall discharge her duty to man, then shall it indeed accomplish a glorious destiny by ministering in no humble degree to the advancement of the cause of God in this world, which is none other than the cause of human intelligence and virtue, the great cause of an ever-progressive civilization. So you can see that Lathrop's discussion around this maps around kind of notions of flourishing and covenant, which would have been common in this period of time of development, even of these public institutions, which were not even really called that at the time. So these emergence of this view was tempered by a lot of things happening. So the Civil War and discrimination across full groups of people. There was questions that started to come out. Can the good society be trusted? Because of these things that were happening in society. There was also Western expansion in the land grant legislation, which contributed to growth in the West, and it was really a means to populate and expand the West. There was also science and religion conflicts. Darwin's piece, Origin of Species, challenges the good society view around kind of scientific views of the world. And I know, as you heard about, was it last week, you talked about predatory wealth in the Gilded Age. And this is a big part of the context in 1870 into 1900, is understanding how could we think about this good society tradition, which paved the way to the progressive era. So I know there's been a lot on John Bascom in the Wisconsin idea. I know that, was it last year that David Hobler? Okay. A terrific book, John Bascom and the Origins of the Wisconsin Idea. I think what's particularly interesting as I was reading around kind of history and religion around this is a particular interest around his post-millennial theology, which was one that was able to harmonize theology with naturalism. And I think this was an interesting, when you think about the progression of the Wisconsin idea. So the post-millennial view was the idea that the world was getting better, and that the university could be a part of the evolutionary process of making a moral and good order to confront the ills of the Gilded Age. So Bascom talked about ushering in the kingdom of heaven on earth, where it was toward this evolutionary process this was able to come about. So in this way, he was able to really direct religious energies toward reform efforts and harmonize this in a way that brought people together from Puritan roots and others who came from this good society view. Interesting in this as well, as this is a complicated story, that he may have pushed this too far as he was eventually asked to resign around things I believe it had to do with various progressive policies that he was pursuing. So what's interesting about Bascom's legacy, and it relates to some of this covenant view, is how we started to think about, for example, Bascom's student Van Hise, and then later Richard Ely. So I think what was fascinating from the archives I found is Charles Van Hise is most commonly known for the phrase, of course, the boundaries of the university are the boundaries of the state. But this was particularly interesting to me in the archives as I found his travel journal where he had some notes called The Significance of the Wisconsin Idea. And so as you see from this, he really anchors this in Christian theology around who is my neighbor, and that is a way to conceptualize his way of thinking of it, which I was surprised given the typical story around Van Hise is that he had more of a secularization of this view. However, what's interesting to me is, in particular, is that he did not say the purpose is the University of Wisconsin reply. I think this gets to some of Gwen's work around, was this a Wisconsin idea or a University of Wisconsin idea? That I would argue that at some point later, there was a shift around how people thought about this. Another interesting piece here is from Professor Richard Ely. who had this piece where he talked about, this was reported in an article called Religion and Evolution in the Progressive Era, in the Political Economy, in the History of Political Economy. But it talked about Ely's words around describing America as a covenant nation with a world redemptive calling. It's interesting when you read those words now that would probably prompt some concerns around kind of colonial views of what the purpose of America was. But I think it's interesting when you look in light of the covenantal view that I described earlier of how this became kind of part of their thinking in carrying out their work at the University of Wisconsin, in particularly later, the work that they did with La Follette and others. So from this particular standpoint, we know the history around this, right? That, as Gwen and others have talked about, the Wisconsin idea was known around promoting self-governance, democratic ideals, and much of this framed within theological traditions. It was around knowledge creation to promote a moral order, prosperity, and social change, which resulted in progressive era policies, electoral reform, regulation, and social legislation. And I would argue, when you look at these pieces together, that at this point, I have up here too the Wisconsin idea, the McCarthy book, that this was really a story about the state of Wisconsin. And maybe less so about the University of Wisconsin, although that was a big piece of it. So if we look into the progressive era into the 20th century, there were several things that happened during that time. So 2 world wars and the rising force of research universities in society. One of the things that was particularly interesting when I look at the shift from the good society to this prosperous or productive society is how the good society idea sort of waned during this period for a few reasons. One in particular, there was growing conflict with science and religion, as we mentioned around kind of Darwin and other works, and also, again, making sense of the Civil War around rival views of Scripture. So could you then use this then to make important decisions around society came up as an issue. And it's interesting that Bascom's post-millennial view of theology that was shared by many, that whole view really quickly fell apart by World War I. And the reason is because of the horrors of World War I, nobody was in agreement that the world was getting better. So that was a particular time that people questioned that and to that point, is the university really a redemptive factor in this kind of case? So this is also part of this called the Academic Revolution, a pretty famous book, Jenks and Reisman. They talked about the specialization and growth of the disciplines. So historian Roger Geiger describes and explains that the University of Wisconsin was approximately one of 25 universities in the country that was fully committed to research as an institutional goal. And during this development around the academic revolution of the disciplines, you saw maybe what you might describe as a mixed legacy. There was specialization, fragmentation, and the rise of disciplinary knowledge, which made great strides for society in different ways. But Jenks and others have described that one fallout was a loss of cohesion with communities. And also with the rise of positivism, there was a departure of applying moral philosophies to the disciplines to pull these together around meaning about what was this good society. This is discussed fully in a book by Rubin, which is called The Making of the Modern University, Julie Rubin. Into that, later on, the GI Bill and mass expansion to accommodate pending employment problem with all the GIs coming back. And at this point, the universities were really in kind of this mode of expansion as it was starting into the next view of time. So how do we think about the Wisconsin idea during this particular period? As I mentioned, the UW in this period was an increasing powerhouse and had very robust outreach services in several areas of extension. Many of you talked about this, for example, the social center movement. There was a lot happening, attributed. People came from many miles away to see what was happening here in Wisconsin, especially early in the century. But as we started to get into the mid-century, it was interesting to see then how the Wisconsin idea was discussed in various ways. One particular quote, this is Frank Holt from 1947, the director of public service, is he talked about to see that new knowledge acquired through research finds a place in the lives of people is a primary function of the University of Wisconsin. So this would fit clearly with this idea of kind of the academic revolution around research and things that was happening in this particular area. What I thought was fascinating too is from my own research in this area, I found a Milwaukee Journal piece that had interviewed Chancellor E.B. Fred, who was a chancellor between 1945 and 58, who was asked about kind of the reciprocal nature of the Wisconsin idea and how is this mutual benefit in this piece. And so Fred explained that the university attracted talent from Wisconsin high school students who would then apply newly acquired knowledge to improve the communities back home. So this was really around what some during that period, when they talk about knowledge flow, would call like the empty vessel strategy around how we kind of pour knowledge into people coming here with the hope that they will then pour it back. And I would argue that this is a departure from what we see, earlier discussions around earlier purposes around self-governance and knowledge and community and democratic purposes, which were more signature of these earlier periods. And in this particular case, is the UW really, so Wisconsin idea became more of a story about the University of Wisconsin than the state of Wisconsin. And I think what was interesting at this period is when asked about the Wisconsin idea, if I may be bold as a now fellow Big Ten neighbor, people may critique. How would this view of the Wisconsin idea be distinguished from peer institutions? So could Minnesota argue this as a thing that we do around pour the knowledge back? So there's questions around that. So thinking about the societal context here in the next, how am I doing on my, is that a right time here? I'm good, right? 6:30. I didn't, okay, good. Yeah, I shouldn't have turned off my phone, but maybe I should have. So the societal context changed then through the 60s, and this is, I think, where we see a lot of this idea from the notion of the covenant to the contract. And so during this particular period, as we know, there was political unrest, new views of society, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, political activism on campus here in Wisconsin and elsewhere. There began during this period a suspicion of institutions of all types, and then a conservative backlash with the Reagan election. And this is where the Chronicle folks made the claim around the date when higher education became a private good, which they attribute to a speech made by, I believe, then Governor Reagan about the University of California. And so higher education at this point was linked more to the prosperous society view due to the idea of massification and equal opportunity. One thing in particular being Clark Kerr's vision of the multiversity, which was reflected in the uses of the university. So people who may be familiar with this, a sort of a classic but controversial piece around the framing of the research university, where Kerr talked about the institution or the research university as a multiversity, as a complex, disconnected city with lots of resources. And essentially the claim was there was great innovation and progress amidst disconnection and growing incoherence. But that this was sort of the new reality of how we thought about the research university in the modern age. Other things happening during that time, inflation, stagnant job growth, and other pieces related to that. So getting back to when I was reading around, it was fun reading these like big books around, moral theory and all this kind of stuff. And some of the religious pieces of it. What I found fascinating too was as we started to see the movement from the post-millennial view, as I mentioned, to a rising pre-millennial view. And so this is why I have Jerry Falwell on this particular picture with Ronald Reagan, because this particular view became kind of more of a fundamentalist rising in the mid-century. Instead of the university or institutions being seen as sort of for redemptive purposes, as it was earlier in this other view, this view sort of started to kind of have the view that religious faith was more privatized, now more of a personal salvation rather than redemptive change. And in this context, the university, instead of taking people on the road to the kingdom of heaven on earth, as Bascom would describe it, it was essentially taking people to hell in a handbasket. So you started to have this animosity that was related to theological thought that developed during this time. It was also during this time where there was sort of this growth around the idea of prosperity gospel in society, so that the pursuit of wealth in this good society tradition was now deemed as sort of okay and part of kind of what the more providential in view of what you were doing in sort of a good society view. And so one of the kind of responses around this, and again, this is not just a UW story, but broader, but here at the University of Wisconsin, is that a corporate model began to look a lot like Kerr's multiversity. And so the Wisconsin idea, there was talk about focusing and teaching and learning or in research as the core business model. Wisconsin idea increasingly framed as continuing education linked to revenue. And ideas of Wisconsin idea more into an idea of a branding strategy, and I'll show evidence around that. This is also a time where there were maybe more technocratic responses as an engine to fix society. So one of the pieces of this, which was interesting to read again in the archives, is this particular important book by George Keller, who was a higher education scholar at University of Pennsylvania, who wrote this very influential book called Academic Strategy, The Management Revolution in American Higher Education. And again, coming cut out of this shifting view about higher education through what many would call now neoliberal thought, he made this particular claim. He told the audience, this was during a 1986 Wisconsin Idea seminar, that the Wisconsin Idea is one of the great public relations coups of American higher education. So he explained it very differently, right, than we would maybe think about some of the earlier thoughts about the early history of the Wisconsin Idea. And so Keller also said, be careful about spreading yourselves too thin and confusing knowledge transfer with fixing all the ills of society. You are educators, not saviors. So the idea around this, again, very in line with this view around the academic strategy, was that you were to keep to your core business model. And that in Keller's view of this is that the Wisconsin Idea was a bonus because it was a built-in branding strategy for the institution. So this, again, a very different kind of view of going into kind of mid-late century around this. Keller, I don't know where he's from, but he was at the University of Pennsylvania as a professor for many years, I think. But I don't know where he was from originally. So during this period too, as I mentioned, it was sort of more of a technocratic view, right? So as Keller was talking about around kind of knowledge transfer and these things, what's the role of the expert at the university? This also across several lines of thinking at the university and elsewhere. So one of the speeches, this came out of a talk that Donna Shalala gave, Chancellor 1988 to 1993. It was called A Mandate for a New Century, Reshaping the University's Role in Social Policy. It was a keynote talk she gave at the University of Illinois. And so here's kind of another reflection, sort of sign of the times of that era, where Chancellor Shalala said, "We've done well delivering miracles of pure science. We've done less well at delivering the miracles of social science, though we need those more than ever." So in the speech, she talked about, the new lab spaces, the shoe leather and notebooks to go to communities. And it was really framed more on the side of around sort of a technocratic way to kind of fix the societal problems, as you saw this. So this, again, very much sort of reflected a separation of expert and community, which I think really shows a difference from earlier views of what the Wisconsin idea was about, as you saw the earlier era of the progressive era. It is also during this period where increasingly the Wisconsin idea was viewed as global in scope. So talking about the Wisconsin idea in Albania and other places where this kind of work could be happening. So here's a piece that I think really illustrates well maybe a juxtaposition from earlier views around covenant to contract. And so this was also from this particular speech. When she started it, she talked about, here was a description of how she described the Wisconsin idea. So in recognition of support from state taxpayers, the university is imbued with a sense of public service. Its faculty and staff are engaged in an extraordinary number of activity and programs that return benefits to the state's citizen. So you can see this is a very contractual way, right? So around returning benefits, right? So it's around an exchange. We get money on the front end to do this, so we are obligated to do this, and we provide return benefits to the state. So this is more the contractual view around this that had developed over a period of time. So another question is what happened at this particular period is maybe some of the legacy of this as developing a contract is that potentially contracts can be broken, right? So here's a book by John Thielen. It's a history of American higher education, where he discusses at this point in history in the late 20th century, it was really a view that universities had overpromised and underdelivered. So these ideas of fixing society and these kind of things, well, we still had plenty of problems in terms of poverty and racism, there's many social ills in society. So Thielen talked about institutions as a troubled giant, and that at this point, that kind of the incoherence of the multiversity started to unravel around this particular case. And so I think you would see then maybe some shifts with how the Wisconsin idea, as I found, started to envelop some criticism that would be in line with this particular view. So as into this era, we started to see that the Wisconsin idea was refrained within conservative traditions. So for example, Michael Joyce, who was with the Bradley Foundation for many years during this period, he talked about the Wisconsin idea as a failed progressive experiment. He argued that it was simply transferred power and corruption from lumber barons to public unions and out of people's hands. And that he made the argument that progressives simply traded one corrupt system for another. And he was making these comments in the context of talking about school vouchers. So that and discussed that vouchers were actually the best of the Wisconsin idea tradition, since it puts governance in the hands of people. Another example of this is a book that reflected on Governor Tommy Thompson's legacy called The New Wisconsin Idea, Reinventing Public Compassion for the 21st Century. In this particular, this came out of a 1997 Blue Ribbon Commission, which linked the Wisconsin idea to state workforce development. The report was titled The New Wisconsin Idea, the Innovative Learning State, and framed it through the lens of innovation and skill building for citizens to compete in the new century. So as I start to get down to our present time, you can see kind of shifts that have happened over time that have our societal, economic, political, religious, and others that have shaped kind of this view of which the Wisconsin idea has become a part of this larger societal change. So societal influences put around the Great Recession of 2008 to the present. So during this period of the Great Recession, I remember after the day was, the market had its worst crash of that period, going to a conference, and one person stood up the keynote and says, well, wonder what people are thinking about of their 401ks that are now 201ks, he called them. And so at this particular, there was growing hardship, disparities of wealth across race, class, urban and rural and urban. There were changing views of society around individual freedoms were preeminent, as seen as, which was very different around when you think about, remember, freedom from oneself, and rather this is more freedom as a personal freedom. In this view, the classical good society view was no longer in even areas seen as aspirational, but increasingly in some cases seen as a bigoted view of society. And people had talked about the media echo chambers, no longer having to listen to other views viewed as fake, and these things coming together as sort of an unraveling, one might argue, of sort of our democratic tradition. In this particular context, we see some interesting pieces around how the Wisconsin idea was framed as an elitist project. I think particularly we think about Kathy Kramer's a terrific book that she wrote, The Politics of Resentment. When we started, we got a good reflection around how people across the state of Wisconsin began to resent what they viewed trouble in urban and other areas and what was happening at the university, and various discussions about kind of the reframing of the Wisconsin idea here. So this one from David Bascom, saying the narrative behind the Wisconsin idea is that the experts would instruct their lessers, especially legislators popularly elected by the rabble, to scrape the manure off their boots before they enter the state capitol. So thinking about that as an elitist project, what's funny is when I see this picture of David Bascom, he looks almost exactly like my Uncle Gary, who actually would say the very same thing about the Wisconsin idea. So if he's watching this on YouTube, he would know and he would agree. So I'm not speaking out of school. And so in this context too, that if you followed the argument of Kathy Kramer's book around leveraging this around the election, and in this particular case, the Wisconsin idea, again, going back to my earlier slide, reframed as meeting the state workforce needs to kind of satisfy that. So here's also one maybe out there interpretation of this as I was reading around these theological pieces that link to this. And it strikes me that Governor Walker, possibly, son of a Baptist minister, would have come out of a deeply embedded good society frame. And potentially even thought about this in these post-millennial terms, although I don't know for sure on that. But in this particular case, that there was no canopy to sort of leverage religious energies toward the university in this particular case. So the legacy around potentially the secularization, that the university not seen as part of redemptive purposes, but the modern university only valued toward instrumental ends, not redemptive ones. So it's interesting to think about potentially what was left to hang on to through a worldview on that would sort of think about relationship to supporting higher education, the university, and its broader purposes. So as I summarize kind of this shift through these lenses, there's particular things that stand out to me and maybe to you, and would love to get some thoughts about that. So one piece particularly is this idea of secularization amid diversification, the collapse of actually what Robert Bella historically called civil religion. So Bella's report of this was really the idea that sort of a non-sectarian faith historically existed within the United States, was a cohesive force a common set of values to foster social integration. This particular Gorski current citation, he's a Yale professor. It's a book called American Covenant, A History of Civil Religion from the Puritans to the Present. His argument is that the civil religion, as opposed to religious nationalism or radical secularism, is the vital center that had held the nation together. And so a lot of these accounts talk about these sort of pieces as society has shifted in demographic changes as well as worldview changes. Some of the other parts of the shift relate to the academic revolution, innovation in place of wholeness, as you could say, from society, the growing loss of faith in institutions. Another good piece is this book called On Thinking Institutionally that sort of tracks how people lost faith in institutions really from the 70s on. This replacement of neoliberal thought in higher education, I thought, that work around Keller, how it was a reframe, and that the idea that it's a modern institution, again, valued for its instrumental ends, which are mostly contractual versus kind of covenantal ends. So one thing that I think about as this is coming to play in reading a lot of different things is there seems to be a sense of loss with the good society tradition, but what do we do with it in the modern age? This is a piece that just came out a few days ago that I thought was relevant. So there's growing a number of questions around this. And I think, as I showed earlier, that the good society had its flaws, that the rhetoric often did not meet the reality. However, the sense of loss from groups around kind of what's become these more material purposes. Wellman, in this case, critiques the university as more of a hollow enterprise. And this is also present in the Wisconsin idea conversation from many different angles. So, for example, a 2015 op-ed piece, Ambassador and former Wisconsin Speaker of the House, Tom Loftus, lamented the dismantling of Bascom's theologically inspired vision, which he referred to the Wisconsin idea in that piece as a poem of faith in mankind. A decade earlier, Michael Joyce, again from a very different way of thinking on this, also discussed the importance of sustaining a moral vision for education. And when you consider that current UW Chancellor Rebecca Blank's scholarship in the field of economics has in some ways conceptualized ideas of justice through these traditions, suggests that campus leaders in some cases are able to recognize these works within these broader traditions. So one thing I've been thinking about as a way for potential conversation and other things you'd want to discuss is I think, when I think about the Wisconsin idea and the important history that Gwen and others have done, I think about the Wisconsin idea as a cultivation of moral imagination. In the sense that, it's not a push again to go back to, a theological framing of this, but it's to say whether you agreed with these kind of early positions or not, that they came from an embedded view around to create a goodness in society. So is there a new or old story for the Wisconsin idea in this, thinking about this kind of moral imagination possibility? And so I guess what I would end with is this particular slide as we think about the compelling issues in front of us in American higher education. Could the Wisconsin idea be a story of healing a divided state and a divided nation? So I think we look just up the street on Bascom Hill to look at Abraham Lincoln and his second inaugural address, where he said, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, let us strong to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and for his orphan." And I'm increasingly interested in around the idea of civic virtue, what it means to kind of live out virtue in a civic space, and what this might mean around bringing people together in a time of a very contentious time in our country. So again, I want to thank you for the opportunity. I think we still have a few more minutes for questions. Again, really grateful for the time here. And one thing I will happy in this context of bringing people together, that Gophers and Badgers can get along as we say thank you and on Wisconsin. Yes.
The work on civic virtue is interesting. Terry Boyd's been writing a lot about the university as a font for civic virtue on the part of its students. And Terry's had a long reputation of working with institutions that are trying to build civic virtue in public capacity. It does seem to me that there's no lack of models of people engaged in virtuous civic activity, at least on a local level. If you start digging around in any community in our country, you will find the heroes and heroines. George Bush called the 1,000 points of light, right? I mean, or Senior Bush called the 1,000 points of light. But how often the context of public discussion is a context which only admits of instrumentality in what causes people to do anything. We don't ask a political candidate, or we seldom talk about political candidates as a person of virtue who is actually committed to a set of ideas because it's the right thing to do. We start looking immediately for what do they get out of this? Or what do their constituents get out of this? So the idea of life as a continuous instrumental argument or instrumental contract, your contract thing, seems so, to me, embedded in our discussion in politics that I don't know how we get out of it. I will also go on and say, around the funeral of President Bush recently, and the people that were in the spotlight again, like Alan Simpson and other people who were virtuous public leaders, there was a lot of interesting stuff there. But how we get to the point of these political figures who disagree philosophically but continue to work together for the public good. I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's a really important point and thing to think through. When I've thought about this, I've thought about how do we think, so if we're in higher education, and my particular area of interest is, we talk about the engaged universities, this kind of university, but what would it look like to create kind of the virtuous university? And there's actually interesting work people might know at the University of Michigan. It's at the Ross School, but it's around kind of this idea of sort of positive organizing and this kind of thing. But they have developed this kind of whole thought about organizational virtuousness and what that means. And sometimes when you think about it as, we've kind of joked, we're at a conference where we were talking about our institution, so this is not to out any particular institution, but we made the comment that, if you were driving down the road and, you actually hit a biker with your car, you would quickly get out, make sure they're okay, and probably any one of us at our institutions, would be responsible and virtuous in doing this. But we joke that if the university itself was driving, it would hit the biker, quickly speed up to get the lawyers, send the PR people back, and take care of him. And so it's the idea is the institution a reflection of the people within it that might have virtue, but not the institution itself? And so I think, part of what's interesting about this virtue literature is it talks about how do you create habits around compassion and trustworthiness and these kind of things. And some of this, I won't go too far on this, but they talk about, they've done studies in hospitals around this, where they have these virtuous hospitals, and they show that those hospitals are way less likely to get sued, because if something happens and they accidentally sew a hammer in somebody's back, they go right to the family and say, we screwed up, we're going to fix it, we're going to make it right. So those are kind of the ways I'm thinking about. But I feel like, maybe our responses at universities is we quickly lawyer up, right? Yeah. And so this relates to me to sort of then how are we what's our role in this civic space, if that's, you see what I'm kind of doing?
Yeah, no, I see that.
Yes?
I think to that point, a good positive first step is Mr. Evers was talking about how he's going to appoint his Board of Regents. And he said he's not going to appoint cronies, and he does not expect those people to be the governor's employees.
Yes.
So I think that's a very good first step, maybe to that for the moral part of it.
Yeah, in terms of how, to think about, those pieces at the state level, it looks like a promising movement. So. Yes?
So your response to the first question raises an issue for me, and that is, who is the university? So when we talk about the university and the University of Wisconsin, and we are, or they are, or it is, it's a pretty drastic oversimplification that we all use.
Right.
And we notice that as part of the institution. So there is an administrative response, and that's something that tries to avoid risk. Speeds up and gets the lawyer back. There is a faculty response, which sometimes can be rather naive politically, and you can characterize each of the various responses in certain ways. Are some of the changes in what we've talked about universities providing to a state, we use the Wisconsin idea kind of as a foundation here, but are some of the changing relationships based on changes within the university and who basically makes the decisions and who speaks for the university and who is the university? I would love to hear your perspective on that.
So the idea of who's out there kind of representing the institution, and this is fascinating because some of my my own kind of research around community engagement and interviewing community partners it's one of these things of with the politicians, right? Well, you love your own politician, but Congress is forget about them kind of thing. I found a lot about that in terms of their local representatives that might be these like kind of boundary spanner folks we talked about that are out in Kewaunee, Wisconsin, and all these folks, that they're highly regarded, but that the institution, you're right, itself is seen as sort of this distant entity around that. And so I think that's always the case, is that people would, in those cases, speak well of maybe some of their local folks who are working with them on particular problems in the state, but would, I think, even like this on thinking institutionally, this work talks about this particular period when the performance of organizations were particularly under fire, and seeing, even without the context of understanding, for example, what was, all that money that was said to be stockpiled here, which was actually, and I understand, I work at the foundation, I know how this works, but those kind of narratives feed on to one another. The one quick thing I would say about that is, you're right, a decentralized kind of piece and everybody's part of it, but what could potentially be the role in being intentional about creating a culture around like virtuous life? So, yeah.
Well, that's a great question, a great answer. The word that you mention a lot in many speakers have is community. So if you have to have at least three things for a community to exist. You have to have consciousness of kind, so you have to feel a we-ness, and as siloed and as broken up as modern campuses are, that's hard.
Right.
Secondly, you have to have some means of reproducing that, usually rituals and traditions and things. Again, we're siloed, we're competitors. And with responsibility-centered budgeting, we're competitors.
Right.
And lastly, moral responsibility, members of the community. We're not rewarded for that. In fact, we're punished for that.
Right. Yeah.
And when you have Becky Blank out there, And I'm in business school. I've consulted for corporations. I've seen CEOs less corporate than executive blank. I sit there and just, if faculty sent it me or something, the message is, don't worry about the truth too much, just don't piss the legislature off. Or don't piss a big donor off. So everything's moral relativism. So if you have moral relativism, if the leader of your university is all about, pragmatism, then the chances of a virtuous university are zero.
Well,
Well, do you know
I don't want to get thrown off and not be able to drink beer on the union anymore for being able to comment on this. So, yeah, I guess I would just say this is that,
who's going to do it?
it's definitely, it's a leadership question. And again, I can't critique what's happening
Who's gonna
here.
hire a chancellor who does that?
But I think, so what's interesting from like this organizational virtuous literature is it's sort of not like a zero-sum kind of thing. So it doesn't mean that if you have like this virtuous stance, you're going to all of a sudden lose money, you're going to have all this kind of stuff. What it actually shows is that these are actually very high-performing organizations. And it's because of their stance on this and building this trust that these organizational actors are actually very engaged and in many cases willing to go an extra mile around these things. So
Facebook was held up as the model of virtuous organizations until they got caught.
What's it?
Facebook.
Oh, yeah. Well, I don't know. I don't know about that. I'm not even on Facebook. Can I admit that on a YouTube video? Hey, well, thank you, everybody. I can barely check my own email. I'm like so behind on things. But so I don't know. So what that means, but I think there are some possibilities around that. But as to say, it's not theoretically impossible. I'm saying.
Well, they call me when you find it.
Okay. Yes.
So a little on history, I kind of agree. You said during the Reagan era, they made the full transition, going from considering the role of the university, good society was a prosperous society. But there's this guy I can't. I don't necessarily remember William Bennett, Secretary of Education.
Right. Yep.
And he, at the time, he was writing these books about cultural literacy and things, which it kind of seems to go against a little bit the contract model or some of these other things that were.
Because he was really like pushing Western canon stuff, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So what I would say that where he was maybe then trying to restore like this good society tradition. Yeah, so I think in that sense, even though you had kind of that, because part of that whole mix was like this whole kind of culture wars kind of thing. And actually, I have this other sort of revised, actually tomorrow I'm getting this other one, where I sort of see these as what I'm calling rival views of higher education as a public good. So these are kind of two rival views, but another one that I think more broadly is around what might be called like the equitable society. And so I think Bennett's work was pushing back against a heavy movement toward that, which was seen as sort of wealth transfer and all this kind of thing, but restoring a Western thought. Oh, yes.
Any kind of cross-national perspectives on these questions in terms of other country perspectives and on these virtuous universities and
You mean like across the country? If I've seen...
other countries' perspectives, like
so
other societies wrestling with these issues.
I think what's interesting is, in general, a lot of these countries are moving toward our kind of heavy neoliberal model, and we're not seeing it kind of really go kind of the other way. I mean, what's interesting, I was actually in Chile a couple years ago, and that's a very Catholic. So they use that as a way to think about kind of their kind of community commitments, I will say this in terms of the work around public engagement or community engagement, that is a movement that is kind of on the rise. Australia is really doing well, and some other countries are, and a lot of this is around, in their case, like indigenous communities of Aboriginal, and so there's some work being done around that. I think, actually, some of my comments tomorrow will be around the growing politics around this too. So kind of whose vision of society gets elevated. So that's an issue.
I
Yeah.
have a question that's kind of technical.
Yeah.
You made a reference to a speech by a gentleman, or a paper, whatever, by a gentleman who was the head of the public service department at the University of Wisconsin. And I believe that, I don't remember the time frame.
It's 1947.
Okay. So my question is, where was the public service department vis-a-vis the extension division, which was the manifestation of the Wisconsin idea, a la Charles McCarthy leaning on Van Hise, to create an extension division, create a dean of extension and outreach and connection. And I'm just wondering, where was that relevant? Because I never heard of the public service department before. Is it the PR department? I mean, in modern times, in all of the discussion we have the Wisconsin idea as public relations. We have the Wisconsin idea as brand. But what was that department? And I'll carry that question even further, because your resume says you studied funding of higher education. Mm-hmm. In my look at the funding of the University of Wisconsin, the budget category I could find that's the closest to money to go for extension and outreach education is called public service. And so, I mean, from a technical question of those little things, really comes from the idea that if you're going to have the Wisconsin idea as a major representation of the institution, you got to pay for it. And Gwen reminded me that that's part of what Charles McCarthy did, was lean on Van Hise to create an extension division. And, the future certainly doesn't look bright in Wisconsin for whether there's going to be budget categories to do extension, outreach, et cetera work. We just destroyed the one institution that had extension in its name. You moved it to Madison. UW system took a piece of it. I will say stole a piece of it. And they're now deciding what the degree structure looks like that are distance delivered degrees. Those are headquartered at UW system now. So where is the funding side of this in current higher education? I come from the co-op extension history and a clear funding stream to do that kind of work. So I'm always curious about where does this come out in the budget?
So, I mean, the first question around the organization at the time, I don't know the details around that. Does somebody know the answer to that?
We can look into that.
Of how the later, of course, I read around 71 and changes that got, and even some critique around that made things even harder for folks. Yeah. In terms of the budget, I mean, so a lot of what we would use, like in the research side of this, is called this IPEDS data, which essentially pulls out, and you're right, I mean, it's labeled as public service. Right. What's sort of interesting around this is that we don't know how uniform that definition is across. So I guess without going into that, these typically would be kind of line item kind of things to put into that. But as we know, all this money is sort of tripping over other pots of money. Right, exactly. But in terms of this as sort of a priority, I think where things are going around, so our own institution at the University of Minnesota, we have this Office of Public Engagement. The way that we think about this work is it's really around kind of transforming ourselves to become an engaged institution. So it's around this idea of culture change. So, for example, one of the things I'm leading now is this review board to help tenure track faculty think about creating high quality scholarship that will meet the standards of this. It's led by a committee of some really high power folks around this kind of thing. And so it's around changing how the university sees itself. But from the funding, people will say, oh, do we have more money to do this kind of thing? But in many cases, we're seeing that people are just using the money they have differently. And it's around community engaged work. And in many cases, too, is leveraging more money because it is community engaged. So it's not seen as an extra pot, but work we would have done anyway, but now we're doing it with external partners. So,
It's now time. I'd like everyone to join me in thanking Dr.
thank you.
Great way to, that was a great talk. So it's been my pleasure to introduce people, which is about the extent of my job here, and hard work. But this has been such a joy in the discussion section for those in it. And we're going to keep this class going, and we're going to pull in new people to teach, and we're going to try to make this our own virtuous endeavor. And there'll be no money in it. In fact, when I told my dean I was teaching an overload for sociology, he said, what's wrong with you? But that's what business teams do. So anyway, thank you so much, and it's been a pleasure. And like I said, I'm going to go drink beer across the street at the appropriate name bar of the library, as if that fool isn't parent or anything. And I'll see you later. Oh, and thanks to Gwen, Eric, Patrick, everybody who's helped with this. Chad Melfer,